All right, U.S. history students, hello. Let's do an instructional video here about the end of the Second World War. And while the end of the war is a joyous occasion for many Americans at the time, because the struggle had been fought and we'd won the war, and for many Americans it meant that their sons or fathers or brothers were coming home. It also, appropriately for the Second World War, it has this grave moral tone, sort of a heaviness to this, sort of a somber conclusion to this war. Harry Truman had become president when Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, and it was it's never a good time for a president to die. I mean, it's like that's always going to be traumatic and chaotic. But wow, it's a really screwed up moment when that takes place in 1945. I mean, the war in Europe was just about over, but the threat that the Soviet Union faced and Joseph Stalin was about to sort of impose on Europe was becoming clear. And meanwhile, the war in the Pacific had a ways to go still, and it was just unclear exactly how Japan was going to be forced to surrender when, Japanese soldiers had not been unwilling to surrender to this point. So that was going to be the challenge. And Americans suddenly had this president that they didn't know, this man, Harry Truman. And Harry Truman had, he didn't really have a long resume. He'd been in the Senate for a while. He'd been vice president for less than a month. And he wasn't really a household name, pretty obscure, a figure from Missouri, sort of short, wore these big Coke bottle glasses because he was totally nearsighted. Wasn't college educated. I mean, he couldn't afford to go to college back in the day, growing up pretty poor in Missouri. He'd run a men's clothing store. He was a tailor, basically, and a small business owner. The Depression put him on a business. He got into politics. He had a reputation of being, I call him plain spoken and profane. He didn't really talk like a politician. He talked like a regular Main Street kind of guy. He had a reputation for being tough and hard-nosed in politics, being good at politics, but also just sort of plain, sort of a straight shooter, I guess you could say. And he didn't pretend to know everything. I think he acknowledged that he was maybe short on book smarts, but he was unafraid to make big decisions and to act boldly when he felt like that was necessary, and he's going to proceed to do that. So let's explore this, and let's talk about the way Harry Truman begins his presidency. He would go on to have what most historians assess as a pretty great presidency in its own right. And so what was it that allowed that to take place? So the first thing on his plate is, how do we close out this war with Japan? Again, Japan is in range of bombings, and the U.S. is pouring it on in terms of these bombings of Japan. Through conventional bombings, that's not the atomic bomb, but just regular bombs, conventional bombs, the city of Tokyo is just leveled. You can see 25% of the city is wrecked, 100,000 Japanese are dead in these bombings as the United States is trying to utterly cripple and destroy Japan's economy, their ability to resist. This is total war, after all. Japan is losing territory left and right as the U.S. and its allies push through and take over these places. Japan is not surrendering. Now, we talked about that phenomenon earlier. I don't want to belabor that point. As this process is going on, as the island hopping has gotten right to the doorstep of Japan, Harry Truman is sort of notified of something that had been so top secret that he hadn't even been aware of it when he was vice president, and that's something called the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project is the United States' top secret project to develop an atomic bomb. And this had been going on for about 3 years at this point. And there's sort of a backstory. It's somewhat famous. Some of you might know it, where Albert Einstein has sort of alerted to the United States to the theoretical possibility of splitting the atom to create an immense energy source that could be used as a destructive weapon. And Einstein says the Germans are aware of this theoretical possibility, the Nazis are, and the Americans need to beat Nazi Germany to the punch, or it would be inconceivable for Hitler to have this weapon. Now, the Nazis are gone. We learned about them, but But the United States finally develops this weapon, summer 1945. And we have three of them. All right, we've developed three. And the first one is used to test. And we detonate the test and we say, yeah, that works. I mean, that definitely blows, that's thousands of times more powerful than any bomb we have. So Truman now is told, we have two of these weapons left. As he describes it later, Harry Truman describes this later, Harry Truman's decision to use the bomb. He says, I asked General Marshall what it would cost in lives to land in Japan. It was his opinion that 250,000 casualties would be the minimum cost. So what's it going to cost in terms of American lives if we do a conventional invasion of Japan like we did on D-Day? And his estimate is 250,000 people will die, Americans only. That's not even counting the Japanese who are being trained to sort of launch suicidal attacks in the face of the Americans, as we learned. The Japanese, remember, we're talking about the suicide of the 100 million was their propaganda. Back to Truman. I asked Secretary Stimson which cities in Japan were devoted exclusively to war production. He named Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We sent an ultimatum to Japan. It was ignored. I ordered atomic bombs dropped on the two cities. Dropping the bombs ended the war, saved lives, and gave the free nations a chance to face the facts. And later on, when people said, surely you must have agonized over this decision to use the atomic bomb, Truman is, maybe to a degree that makes you uncomfortable. Truman's like, no, that wasn't a hard decision. He says the atom bomb was no great decision. It was merely another powerful weapon in the arsenal of righteousness. For Harry Truman, in a certain sense, he's like, this is an arithmetic question. Which move will save more lives? Dropping the atomic bomb will save more lives and it'll end the war today. Now, look, there's an opposing view here we must consider. Some of the scientists who were involved in the development of the Manhattan Project were opposed to its use. One scientist in the statement signed by some of those scientists reads, we, the undersigned scientists, believe that the United States ought not resort to the use of atomic bombs in the present phase of the war, at least not unless Japan is given an opportunity to surrender. A nation which sets the precedent of using these newly liberated forces of nature for purposes of destruction may have to bear the responsibility of opening the door to an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. The scientists are saying, we push this button, you open the door to something new and horrifying. And we don't want to be the ones that open the door to that new and horrifying thing unless it is absolutely avoidable. Now, Truman decides, of course, we're going to do it. It's going to save American lives. It's going to end the war today. And his argument is it's frankly going to save Japanese lives too. The way it works, the United States does give this ultimatum. We announced to Japan, we have a weapon of new and terrifying power unless you surrender unconditionally. Like, you don't get to decide anything in the post-war situation, an unconditional surrender, and then we will decide your future. Unless you surrender unconditionally, the United States will use this weapon against you. Japan doesn't surrender. The first bomb is dropped. This bomb is dropped in the city of Hiroshima. 60,000 are dead from this bomb's detonation within minutes. The bomb detonates high in the air. It's designed to detonate about a mile up in the air, and the blast force goes down, which is why you can just see like everything gets flattened, or then it's flattened and is blasted out in the central radius of the bomb blast. If the force of the blast or the force of the debris moving doesn't kill you, the heat will just incinerate you. And it's like nothing humanity has ever seen before. 3 days pass. The United States is sort of waiting for the surrender, and Japan doesn't surrender. Now, what we know now is that Japan's military leadership is just scrambling like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out, what do we do? Do we surrender? Do we fight to the death? Surrender? Do we fight to the death? And the U.S. says, again, unconditional surrender. Do you offer your unconditional surrender? After 3 days, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. Now, Japan doesn't know that we're out of them, and that it would take 6 months to build more, to develop more. If that, maybe it'd take longer than that. As far as they know, we've got another dozen lined up. And at that point, the military leadership of Japan still can't decide what to do. It tells you how deeply embedded this suicidal ethic, this Bushido ethic has gone. they actually turn to the Emperor of Japan, who's really just a figurehead, sort of like, King Charles in England, and they ask him, the emperor, to decide, and he says, we surrender. And so Japan surrenders at that point, and the Second World War is over, finally over, after 6 long years of fighting. The effects of the bomb, the immediate effects are terrible. The long-term effects are also frightening, involving radiation sickness, radiation poisoning that will go on actually to affect the next generation too. It's interesting here to note, like you can see the burn markings on this. This is, I don't know who this woman is or the extent of it, but I just have found that students find something kind of horrifying about the weird pattern of the print of this woman's dress appearing on her clothing. We'll note in this American newspaper, Japanese surrender, World War II ends, and it says Pearl Harbor is avenged. Many, many, many times over. I'm not sure that Pearl Harbor and this are equivalent, but there's been a long and really ugly and really awful war in between. And from Harry Truman's perspective, he just says, this ended the war this week. We're doing it now to end the war this week and save lives. And if people don't like me for it later on, then they don't like me for it later on. When we consider the casualties in the Pacific, let's note a couple things. Mr. Welly wasn't joking when I said Japan's invasion of China was something horrific. Guys, it was something horrific. Every skull represents 100,000 civilians dead at the hands primarily of the Japanese. Their invasion of China rivals anything the Nazis were doing in Europe. There was some true wickedness uncorked in the 1930s. This here has to do with, there's sort of 2 different governments you can think of in Japan. There's a Chinese communist and the Chinese nationalists. That's more detail than you need to know, but that's what all these flags represent. In Japan, we'll note all the civilian death that's going on. So the skulls are deaths from the conventional bombings of Japan, and the first aid signs is radiation deaths from the atomic bombs. And then the fighting in the Pacific is interesting because there is a 7-to-1 ratio of casualties, of dead. 100,000 dead Americans versus 700,000 dead Japanese soldiers. That is not how war typically looks. How do you end up with a 7-to-1 ratio? By fighting to the point of suicide. That sort of suicidal ethic is what creates this. Let's consider, though, in the end, the costs of the United States intervening to fight on behalf of these countries and on behalf of ourselves, our own defense, because certainly this wickedness was going to make its way to us. It did at Pearl Harbor. The sacrifice made by Americans, that's certainly worthy of our honor and our appreciation. We lament the missteps that were taken, particularly, I suppose, with regard to Japanese Americans. We seek to understand some of the root causes of exactly what went down. At any rate, thank you guys for engaging with this learning here. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.